Okay, here we go. Tonight I'm going to make a video showing you how to take the basic chat room app that we began and turn it into something that's a little bit more functional. So this video builds off the last one, and at the end of the last video I had a simple server that could accept a post request that you put into this input box here. And when you clicked send, it would send the post request off to the server, and then the server would respond by giving you a history of all post requests that it had ever received, including requests, incoming data requests that came from other clients. So that means if other people could connect to your server in your home, let's say, because you gave out your IP address, then they could communicate with you by putting in a post request, and that post request would eventually make its way to your browser screen when you put in your own post request. So if that's unfamiliar to you, you should go back and watch the last video so you can remember how it goes. But at this point, I think we all have, if you're in my class and you're following along, then we all have a working server that's capable of doing this. My server is currently running. Here it is. This is the code for it in my trusty text editor Atom, which is open on my newly updated Mac that is now running Catalina, I see. And my server is running, in fact. And I should be able to put in a post request in here. Let's put in Wibble and click send. And you can see I get foo had been sent before. So if I now put in an additional wobble and send that with the post request, you can see I'm getting that. And again, I stress anybody connected to this server right now would see the same thing every time they sent a request. So this is a basic, very basic chat type of functionality, and what we're going to do is expand on it and make it much better. So at the end of the last video I said there were basically 4 problems that we needed to focus in on. Number one, and these are in no particular order, the first problem is as it stands right now, we don't have any permanent storage. And what that means is that every time we quit and restart the server, we will lose all of the data that we stored. So that data essentially is supposed to represent chat messages that people have sent. All right, so that problem needs to be remedied. The solution to that is to create a database that runs on the server and stores the data permanently. And then every time you restart the server, you access that database to repopulate your array with the chats. Or you simply access the database when you need to send the chats back to the clients. We'll do that another day. All right, so I'm not going to focus on that right now. That's not the problem I want to solve today. Number 2, the other problem is that we don't have any way of having the server we don't have a way of getting the server to push new messages out to all clients that are listening. So in other words, and I highlighted this problem at the end of the last video, if I want to see what somebody else has sent potentially to me, the only way that I can do that is by sending another post request myself. And then whether I send something with data or even if I just send blank and just click the send button, I have to initiate the process of communicating with the server before I'll get information back from it. And that's because the web works that way, because the HTTP protocol is very much initiated by the client. So there's no way for the server to say, hey, you know, somebody just gave me, some other client just gave me some information. Hey, everybody out there who's checking me out, you might want to know this. Well, there is, as of this course that we're doing right now, no easy way of making that happen. Okay, so that's a problem. That's number 2. Number 3 is that the layout of the chats or the messages is lame, right? It's not lame. It's not representative of what we want to see in a functioning app. So that's a JavaScript problem and a CSS styling problem, and that also has to be addressed at some point in the future. So we get a nice little scrolling box or window of some kind going down the left side of the page with the different messages from different people. And while we're at it, as we talk about different people, there is also the problem of this, that messages don't have, or messages aren't uniquely associated or aren't associated with a unique user. All right, so there's no name associated with any of these messages. All right, another problem. And I think if we could solve all 4 of these, then we have a pretty good understanding of the type of structure and the type of development that needs to be done to make an app that many people use on a regular basis. So we're going to tackle these one at a time with a series of videos. The first one I'm going to do tonight is this one right here. Let's talk about getting the server. I'm starting with number 2. Let's talk about how it is that we can get the server to push out information when somebody else posts, so that you, who are also connected, can see it. And actually, we're going to fake it in a way. We're not going to teach the server how to do this. All right? And I mentioned previously there is a way. It's called WebSockets, but that's a technology that I think is best reserved for something later. So right now I want to focus on a trick, a way around this problem. So what we're going to do tonight, what I'm going to do, is I'm going to write some code that's client side, mostly, and I'm going to have the browser repeatedly ask the server at some set time interval, hey, is there anything new? Is there anything new I should know about? How about now? How about now? How about now? How about now? And it's just going to keep firing off that request over and over again at some reasonable fixed time interval. We won't do it every 10 milliseconds, but we also won't do it every minute. And the server will respond with the current status of this array every time the client asks for it. Okay, and that is one way, for a long time, that's the way that people solved this problem with communications. So I'll say it, I've said it before, I'll say it again, but to stress that the communication between client and server has to initiate with the client. It must start there, so that's what we're going to do here, okay? All right, so the first thing I'm going to do is actually, I said I'm going to write a lot of client code, and I am, but before I do that, the first thing I'm going to do is actually write a little bit of server code. So I'm going to go back on that. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to create another route on my server, which is going to be a get route, not a post route like you see here. And the intent of this route is going to be simply to listen for when a client asks for the current list of messages. Unlike this one, right? The job of this route is to accept incoming data and to put it into the array, and then it's just kind of, it's an afterthought that we send all the messages back. We don't even have to do that. We could actually get rid of that if we want to, because I'm about to write a route right now that the sole purpose of it is just to send the current array of messages. So as I said, it's going to be a get route. So instead of app.post, I simply initiate as app.get. And I need a name for that route, so I'm just going to say it, I'm going to call it messages. And then, as is typical, that app.get method takes a couple of arguments. The first argument is the name of the route. The second is the callback function, right? And again, I'm going to use an anonymous function. So request and response will be my variables in there. And here we'll write it inside these curly braces. So the job of this function is, as I said, to just listen and send back, just simply to respond with whatever the current status of all the messages are. So I don't need to do very much here. I don't need to get any information, or I don't need to receive any information from the client. I'm literally just going to say response.send, and then I'm going to pass back the messages, which, if you recall, is an array. That's this up here. Okay, so that's it. Very little server code needs to be written for this. App.get. All right, now I'm going to go back to my client-side JavaScript, which is right here. And this is where I'm going to do the majority of, I'm going to write the majority of the code. So I'm going to create a new function, and it's just going to be called, I want to think of something reasonable here. It could be called get messages. It could be called query server, because you're asking for that. So reasonable names, if you can think of them, obviously, avoid meaningless function names like this. So I kind of like get messages. So let's go with that. And this request is going to look a lot like the previous one that we did up here. So we're going to use another XML HTTP request, only it's a GET request, not a POST request. So it's going to be actually even easier to write because we don't need to actually send a payload. Remember, the purpose of a POST request, that's this guy here, is essentially to send a payload of data to the server. Well, we're not doing that. We're just asking to get information that's in its array. So let me copy, I think for the time being. We'll just copy these lines right here. And I'm going to have to change it greatly. Okay, so I can keep this variable. Right, it doesn't matter. Here it was a local variable inside this function anyway. So this is out of the scope of that function. So I can use the same variable name. It's not going to conflict in any way. So that's cool. And I'm going to come in here. I'm going to change this to get. And it's all capital like that. And then I'm going to change the name of the route to match the route that I just wrote on the server. So back to the server code. Remember, it was /messages. All right, so back to here, like so. All right, I'm not going to need to set the request header because I'm not actually sending any content, so I don't need to specify what type of content I'm sending. I'm just asking for something, so that can go. I am going to keep the event listener, okay, and I'm going to change the I'm going to comment out the body of this function for now. All right. I may put that back. All right, so I'll leave that alone, and then I'm just going to say xhr.send, and I have no package to send because it's not a POST request, so that is empty. It's literally just send. That's it. All right. So whenever this message or whenever this XML HTTP request gets made, the server will respond at this route by sending back the array of messages. Okay. Now how do we make that happen? I think for clarity, before we do anything fancy, I think what I'll do is I'll make a button that triggers this particular event. And that way you can see it kind of happening manually. All right? And in fact, I'll just use the send button. I'll just do that all over again. And although if I do that, I won't be able to actually send messages to the server to populate it. So you know what, let me go ahead and I'm going to go back to my server and I'm going to quit it because I did change code there, and I'm going to restart it. Okay, and right now it's empty, so I don't have anything there. So I'm going to go back and just kind of fill it with some information. All right, so let's put some messages in. So if I just click send now, you can see it's empty and I have nothing. So let's put in foo, and let's put in hello, and let's put in bar. All right, and let's put in bat. Okay, or bet. So now we know we have some stuff in the array. All right, now I'm going to come back to here, and I'm going to take my send button, which is, where is it right here? All right, it's right up here on line 5. And you see how I have my event listener for the send button's click is calling this function send. That's this right here. Okay, so actually I'm going to change that, and I'm just going to have it call get messages. Now I'm going to need to actually go back and put that back to the way that it was in a little while, but just for the time being, because I don't feel like recreating another button and having that button trigger this request, I'm just going to hack it and just switch what the button does temporarily, okay, and then we'll go back and we'll just put it back to the way that it was. Okay, so all right, I save this code. All right, I'm going to go back and refresh the page. Now I haven't quit the server, so all of the messages are still there. and I'm going to click send. But the thing is, when I click send now, I can't actually send anything, right? Because send triggers, the send button triggers the get messages function, which is this. And I'm not actually doing anything in response to getting it back. So it might be more appropriate at this point if I just kind of maybe throw an alert in here. And so let's just alert this dot response text. All right, just kind of as a proof of concept. So every time I click on the send button, it should hit that get route on the server. The server will dump back the list of messages, and then I'm going to alert them right here. Let's see how it goes. So refresh the page. We'll come back. We'll click send. Nice. Okay, there's my pop-up. You can see there's the list of them. I can click OK. I can click send. I can click send as many times as I want to. But at this point, I can't use the box anymore, right, because I've disabled that functionality. Right? But at least I can receive what's there. So that tells me that the communication is working, and I wanted to do it that way because in a minute it's about to get a little more complicated, so I wanted to make sure that it worked first. All right, let's get rid of the alert. Now let's go back and put these 2 lines of code in, which were the original way that I displayed the list of messages on the page. So I'll save it, I'll refresh it. So now without the alert, I'm just going to get that array that's printed right there. And I can keep clicking send, and you know, the request is going and it's coming back, and it's going and it's coming back. And you don't see anything changing because it's happening so quickly that the array is just static. It's the same thing that it was before. Okay? If I refresh, it's not there. If I click send, it is there. All right, so it should be clear at this point that that send button is working. So now I'm going to go back, and instead of the get messages up here, I'm going to put my button back to doing what it did before. I'm going to have it just be trigger the plain old send method right here so I can post things back to the server. So the button is back to where it was. What I want to do now is figure out a way to have this get messages function fire repeatedly without me, the user, having to do anything, so that it can routinely update get an update of the contents of the message array from the server. The way that there are a couple ways to do that, but the way that I'm going to choose to do it is by creating a function, or by using a function known as setInterval. And so before I do it, let me take you to the documentation on it. So it's called the window.setInterval method, and we can look at it at the W3 documentation, which is fine. All right, and the way it works is fairly simple. So setInterval is called on the window itself, but you can actually call it without the word window. I'll show you what I mean in a minute. So setInterval is a function that takes a function as its first argument. That is a function which is often referred to as a callback function. And then as its second argument, it takes the number of milliseconds that you want between calls to this function that's here. All right, and you can visit this yourself if you want to, and do the try it yourself, and see how it works. All right, but it's at first it looks confusing. The first time you write it, you make a couple mistakes, and then after you write the setInterval function 2, 3, 4 times, it becomes second nature. It's just something that you do very often when you're programming for the web. All right, so I'm going to come back to here and write it. Now I can say window.setInterval, which is technically how it's specified. It's a function that you call on the window itself, but as it would be in browsers, if you leave out the word window, then it's assumed. So you can just say setInterval, like so. All right, now I said there are 2 arguments inside of it. The first one is a function. So I could go ahead and write an anonymous function like I've done many other times, like this, right? And that would be my first argument, and then I'd still here have to have a second argument like 3,000 milliseconds, which is equivalent to 3 seconds. But the thing is, I already have the function that I want to fire every 3 seconds. It's this one. It's get messages, right? So I'm not going to not going to use this anonymous function. Instead, what I'm going to do is I'm literally going to put get messages in here. It's the callback to this function. Again, you don't want to do that. Don't put the parentheses there. It's just plain old get messages. The name of the function, it's a reference to that function right there. So set interval, get messages, and then the time interval that you want to have it repeatedly called at. So 3,000 milliseconds, that's 3 seconds. I don't know, I think maybe that's a little bit long for testing. Let's try having it go every 2,000 milliseconds or every 2 seconds. And that's basically it. What that means is that when the page loads, every 2 seconds, this will happen. It will call this function, and that will send a request off to the server, and it'll say, hey, give me the messages, and the server will give you the messages. And it's quite possible that nothing has changed in that period of time, in that 2 seconds. But maybe somebody else responded, and so, there is a change. And that's how we get around this problem, all right? So let's check it out. Before we go ahead and do it, I could say, I could, at this point, disable this behavior here if I wanted to, because I now have this function getting all the messages. So do I really need to have the messages get sent back automatically every time I post a new message? Or do I just want this function to handle it all? Now, I don't know that there's any harm in leaving this as it is for the time being, but that's something for you to consider. Okay, we can very well leave it. So let's do that for now. I'll save it, and let's go back and see what the page looks like. So there's the page. Okay, and I'm just going to open up the console. Oh, I have to refresh it. Sorry. Now there's nothing there. There's nothing there. There's nothing there. Now there is, because 2 seconds went by. And if you watch over here, you'll see that every 2 seconds there's a new info here. A little message. It says XHR finished loading the GET request. Right. So the timer is working, and it's just sending request after request after request to get the updates. It's really cool, right? It works. If I go to the network tab, you can see all of the requests coming in, being sent and coming back one after another. And they're all coming back okay. That 200 code is what you always want to see. Right? Cool. So let's check it out. Now, let's open up another browser window. So we'll make a new Chrome window, and we'll go to localhost. And again, this represents perhaps somebody with a different computer. They just got the update. Okay, now let's be that person and let's post something. So let's say it is Sunday night. So I'm going to click send, and then I want you to watch in the window on the left. And what'll happen, there'll be a delay, but in 2 seconds, you'll see that this message gets added to this array over here on the left-hand side. Here we go. Send. There it is. Okay. And similarly, this person can do the same thing now. Let's shrink my window down so you can see both windows at the same time. So over here, let's post tomorrow is Monday, send, and watch now, 2 second delay, and it appears over there. Okay, so we got it. Now you can send something, and everybody else that's listening will get an update 2 seconds later. Okay, if that's not fast enough for you, well, we can change it. There's nothing keeping us from dropping this 2,000 down to 200 milliseconds. Let's save it and try again. Let's refresh both pages, okay? All right, there's the array. Watch how much quicker it is now. Good night. There it is. Almost instantly, right? Good morning. Again, almost instant. All right, so super cool. Now, you have to strike a balance, because you don't want to generate unnecessary network traffic with unnecessary requests happening across the network over and over again if you don't need to. So these are relatively lightweight exchanges that are going on. We're not sending a tremendous amount of data at all back and forth, so it's really not a big deal. Do you need every 20 milliseconds to get an update? When you consider the fact that animated games tend to update their screens about every 15 milliseconds, I'm not sure for a chat app that we need that kind of a refresh rate for our messaging. And at some point, latency of a network becomes significant enough that it's not going to make a difference anyway. Because keep in mind, you are, in a real scenario, you wouldn't be using two different windows on the same computer. These could be two different clients on two different computers on opposite sides of the country, communicating with a server in Canada, for all we know. So, you kind of strike that balance for what you need, and I would argue that setting this to 20 milliseconds is definitely unnecessary. If I do that and I come back to the console over here, right, you'll see if I refresh the page, it's just going to spawn requests at a ridiculous rate over and over again. I don't think I saved it here. Right, so now you can see how many requests and how quickly they're being generated. And it's just unnecessary. So I'm going to go back. I think, maybe every 1 second would be reasonable to work with. And now you can watch the requests coming in. And so that's one way of creating a situation where the client can continuously be updated from the server. One way. It's probably the easiest way to do it. It's not necessarily the best way, and I've already mentioned that WebSockets are a better technique, although not something that I would choose to do just yet. The technical name for what we just did is it's called polling or continuous polling. And while it works, it does have some drawbacks. One major drawback is that if I just continuously fire off a request every second to the server, well, what happens if the server doesn't respond? You always have to keep that in mind, right? What if there's a network delay or some other problem, the server is down, and I get no response. So now I'm just stacking up hanging requests on top of each other over and over again. That's not great to do for your browser. So what else could you do? Well, a way of improving this would be to rewrite it, and instead of using the set interval function, you could use something called set timeout. And set timeout just does something once after a certain amount of time passes. And you could poll once, and then you could wait for the response to come back. And if and when the response comes back, then you could poll again. So you could have the return of the data from the server be the cue, the trigger rather, that causes the next GET request to be sent out. And again, if you were doing that, that would be using the set timeout function, which is just a one-shot timer, as opposed to the set interval, which just fires off automatically every so many milliseconds. So that's another way to do it. And then you could go to something that's a little bit more complete, known as long polling, which is basically a way, we would have to write a little more code on the server side to do that, but what that is essentially you send a request from the client, and the server doesn't respond until it has some information worth responding with. So you sort of keep the request open, because right now in the server code, which I have closed, let me reopen it so you can see. Right, so right now in the server code, which is right here, when this request comes in for the messages route, we just automatically send back messages just like that, right? But we need not necessarily do it that way. We could actually have the server wait until there was some data to send back. And at that point in time, we could send it back, and then the client could make the decision when it gets the data back to maybe send another request, or it could time out. We could have it so that if the request takes more than 20 seconds to come back, we could just say timeout, wait, and send a new request. But those strategies involve writing code again on the server side to delay the sending back of information until there's something meaningful to send back. That technically is called long polling, and forever that's kind of what people settled on. That was the way that a lot of this was done. None of this that I'm mentioning tonight is really a legitimate push technology. A push technology would be something that allowed the server to initiate the communication with the client, so that when something changed on the server, it could say, hey, wait a minute, hey, you 6 clients that are connected to me that I'm keeping track of, that I still have a connected relationship with, here you go, I'm going to send you information. For that, we need the WebSockets to get that going. But I think everything builds in stages. So right now I've shown you something that is functional, but arguably not the best way to do it. Whether or not it's worth it to try to do some of those other tricks where you use the set timeout and then wait for the request to come, wait for the response to come back, and then send another request at that point. I don't know. That's if you want to play with that, by all means, go ahead. So if you're following along from my class, which many of you are at Staples High School, then your job is to get this to work. So do what I did and get to the point where you can actually communicate this way with your server. Get maybe somebody else with a computer in your home to visit your server, give them their IP address, and have them go there and communicate back and forth with your 1 second set interval to make sure that that it works. And if you wanted to investigate something else, if you wanted to go a little bit further with it, then you could look up long polling as a technique, and you could say, well, how do I make that legitimately happen? How do I do that? And it's definitely not a bad thing to know, but I think given the limited amount of time that we have, at least in terms of this class that I'm teaching here, it might be more valuable if at some point we just kind of jumped right in and went to the WebSocket approach to get the job done. That's a more legitimate type of push technology. All right, thanks for watching, and take care.